I think Islam hates us.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
Recently, the current President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, has proposed a restrictive immigration ban on a number of countries around the world. This executive order was created with the purposes of limiting the entry of foreign terrorists into the U.S. President Trump believes that this legislation will protect American citizens and the values they represent. This sentiment has reoccurred in a number of events throughout U.S. history. When analyzing immigration policies throughout U.S. history, one can begin to understand how these pieces of legislation represent change and continuity.
Trump's most recent immigration ban has proposed to prevent immigrants from 7 predominantly Muslim countries from entering the United States. The order intends to reduce the number of refugees from 110,000 to 50,000. Terror attacks have spread fear across the United States. Donald Trump's executive order calls for a harsher screening process of visas before entering the country. Because of deteriorating conditions in the 7 countries, President Trump believes that terrorists will use any means to enter the country. The contents of the order represent a larger societal fear that arose after the tragedy on September 11th. Many men and women who were promised resettlement assistance after fighting alongside the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan are now being denied entry to the United States. The only citizens from the 7 countries in the ban that are allowed to enter the United States are those who represent a religious minority susceptible to persecution.
Immediately after the proposition of this legislative agenda, the Ninth Circuit Court blocked it, and now the order is in the revisional stage.
Despite its original purpose to halt foreign terrorism, the ban has been labeled unconstitutional Muslim ban that violates the First Amendment's requirement for freedom of religion. Donald Trump is willing to take desperate action to pass his policy.
On the one hand, this is a court, not the president, saying we're not persuaded by the president's argument that this is a national security issue of so much urgency.
As many officials were labeling his ban unconstitutional, Trump regarded a different opinion of his executive order. Donald Trump believes that even if his legislation represents a ban on Muslim individuals, it is protecting the United States from who he believes to be bad people. Immediately after being signed, the executive order sparked massive controversy amongst the public. Although it has been blocked, the order continues to spark emotional sentiment amongst the public. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was created after a wave of male Chinese immigrant workers settled in California for the gold rush and cheap railroad jobs. Advocates of anti-Chinese immigration believed that they lowered the cultural and moral standards of American society. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first law to restrict immigration to the United States, was implemented to law in 1892 through an executive order signed by President Hayes. The law states that Chinese immigrants endanger local communities and are not beneficial to the country. This law was very popular and almost completely stopped immigration from China for 10 years. An extremely popular slogan of the time was "The Chinese must go." This statement was basically used interchangeably with the Chinese Exclusion Act. The sentiments were based off economic fears and racism. Chinese immigrants took many mining and railroad jobs and were willing to accept much lower wages than their white counterparts. In the West, where immigrants settled, whites boycotted and rioted Chinese businesses and often forced them off their land. Chinese immigrants had no ways to become citizens, and every Chinese American had to have official documents in order to not be deported. Courts had the power to deport any Chinese immigrant, but were not able to give citizenship under any circumstance. This discrimination had no opposing voice, as immigrants had no political power, and the media portrayed Asian Americans as foreign and immoral.
Chinese immigrants that were caught trying to enter the country would either be fined $500 or jailed for a year. These punishments were also used for people that were smuggling and helping Chinese immigrants get into the country. In order to avoid legal troubles, Chinese Americans had to receive special certificates so they could re-enter the country if they left. This was known as the Geary Act. Media was strongly against immigration from Japan and China, and some prominent organizations even called for a boycott of all Japanese and Chinese restaurants, tailor shops, and wash houses. The general boycott was meant for people who supported American workers and didn't want Chinese immigrants to lower the standard of living and the morals of the country. Anarchism rose as a large concern after the Haymarket bombing and the assassination of President McKinley. Anarchism began to get regulated in 1894 where immigration officials would review immigrants' political views before letting them enter the country. Police began to be aware of anarchists and were often violent against them and made many arrests.
The Anarchist Exclusion Act banned the entry of immigrants who had political views that could be considered to represent the principles of anarchism. Those who spoke out against the law and declared for free speech were often immediately deported. The act was amended in the Immigration Act of 1918, which expanded what it meant to be a dangerous anarchist and made it easier for anarchists to be deported. Americans were not looking for an excessive amount of immigrants from war-torn countries in Europe. Many considered that immigrants from Eastern Europe would have anarchist and socialist ideologies. Emma Goldman, a known leader of the anarchist community, had grown up in the Russian Empire and was later deported to Russia. A New York Times editorial found Americans strongly agreed with deporting those with ideologies similar to Emma Goldman. Theodore Roosevelt expressed what most Americans felt when he stated in his first congressional address that the U.S. should keep the destructive ideology out of the country. The law excluded not just anarchists, but others considered undesirable, including epileptics, beggars, pimps, and prostitutes. At this time, Americans had very little patience for immigrants and weren't sold on the concept of the melting pot.
FDR's presidency, the United States was facing serious economic hardships. FDR's biggest focus during his presidency was to revitalize the United States economy through a number of policies. While preoccupied with economic concerns, FDR took limited action to help Jewish refugees who were being persecuted in Nazi Germany. FDR's biggest concern with loosening refugee policies was that Nazis would be able to infiltrate American society disguised as Jewish refugees. FDR's primary solution to the serious predicament was to recommend a massive resettlement program of the Jewish people to South America and Africa.
FDR's policies were viewed by some as un-American. The Statue of Liberty has always represented the United States' open arms in regards to endangered immigrants. Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany may represent some of the most persecuted citizens of the 20th century, and FDR made significant efforts to limit their immigration into the country.
The Gentleman's Agreement was an informal arrangement between the U.S. and Japan, in which the U.S. placed no restrictions upon Japanese immigration, while the Japanese government limited visas into the U.S.
The issue of Japanese immigration arose after the state of California was motivated to segregate Japanese students in public schools. If Roosevelt could suspend the immigration of Japanese citizens through this agreement, the state of California would rescind their segregation order. President Roosevelt's main purpose for this agreement was to calm immigration tensions between the two countries. Japanese citizens found a loophole that would allow them to enter the country. Women from Japan were able to get around the visa restriction by utilizing the picture bride method. This was the tactic of having arranged marriages with men through photographs before immigrating to the country. Because of this widely used strategy, the Japanese did not face extreme gender imbalance like the Chinese during the Chinese Exclusion Act. Japanese and Chinese had strict immigration restrictions because of widespread prejudice around the country. In both instances, this discrimination was most prevalent in the state of California. Immigration restrictions like the Gentleman's Agreement and Chinese Exclusion Act would continue to affect the two populations for decades to come. Like many immigration policies throughout U.S. history, there was an extreme vetting process involved. Although the U.S. government was not involved in an official approval process, many citizens around the country were concerned with properly defining Japanese immigration. In a quote from the U.S. ambassador to Japan, a concern about distinguishing worker from gentleman was identified. The U.S. wanted to be certain that their workers would be more privileged than any Japanese American workers. This was a very similar sentiment to those expressed during the Chinese Exclusion Act. By limiting immigration of Japanese workers, the United States would ensure job security for American citizens born in the United States.
All of these immigration policies represent recurring themes throughout American history. Many of these policies were implemented because they threatened traditional American values. By understanding past restrictive immigration policies, we can better comprehend the legislation that affects the future of our civilization. America's history has been defined by the oppression of marginalized groups. Without understanding this maltreatment, one can never fully understand the history of our country.